morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you to organize things, and you should see that. And I've also opened the chat box, and I invite you to go ahead and introduce yourself to your colleagues if you'd like. And I will, throughout this presentation, stop and ask questions, and we'll use the chat box to kind of have a dialogue. But please feel free, if you have questions anytime as we go along, or comments you'd like to make, that you just go ahead and put them in the chat box. We're going to talk about a really interesting topic today. In their own words, women's petitions to Congress. This presentation will give you resources that you can use to bring examples from the political actions of American women, primarily in the century before they got the right to vote. So many people might think that women were not politically active before they could vote, but that's not true. They were in fact quite active, and these petitions will give you a way to immerse your students in studying their activity. So, you know, we're just celebrating the centenary of the 19th Amendment, and by winning the right to vote, women took a huge step toward equality in American life. But it wasn't a complete victory, and it did not come easily. Suffrage was achieved by a century of women participating in civic action and nonviolent civil disobedience. Today, I'm going to discuss the primary sources that will help bring their stories to life for your students. Again, as we said in yesterday's webinar, but if you're new, this is new for you. This is the landing page when you go to archives.gov, which is the main website for the National Archives. And as I mentioned previously, there's a wealth of information you can get from this address, probably over 1 million primary sources through the Research Our Records tab, and a lot of teaching resources from the third tab from the left, which says Teachers Resources. In that tab, you'll find links to professional development opportunities and document analysis sheets that you can use to coach and scaffold the work of your students with primary sources. So archives.gov is the front door to the National Archives. And as Jim mentioned, I work for the Center for Legislative Archives. We have the records of the Senate and the records of the House of Representatives from 1789 to today. And we have a website with lots of resources for teachers. So I hope that when we finish today, you'll take a moment and go into our website at archives.gov/legislative. You see the address on the screen there. And you'll find over 40 lesson plans, 5 ebooks, and a digital app about the Bill of Rights that are based in the records of Congress and give you tools that you can use to teach your students about Congress and representative government. Our topic today is really based in the First Amendment, because the right to petition is one of the 5 rights that the First Amendment protects. And it's because of this right that even though they couldn't vote, women could be politically active. Women use their right to petition to make their voices heard, to make their opinions felt, and to bring the weight of public opinion to the attention of Congress about a lot of issues. And we're going to take a chronological sample of them. But if you want to get a sense of what the records of Congress look like, this photograph shows you a collection of 19th century petitions. We often talk about the age of Andrew Jackson as the age of grassroots politics. And from an archive point of view, this is what grassroots politics looks like, because groups of individuals began amassing big rolled petitions. And, you know, you see like several sizes and types of them here, but you notice in the back, there's a great big one that looks like a bale of hay. That would be thousands and thousands of signatures on separate sheets of paper that were then joined together and delivered to Congress. Others are of the same type, but maybe a little smaller in size. You see one in the back tied with the red ribbon and so on. And, you know, the idea was that you would send your opinions to Congress in a big collection showing a lot of like-minded people, and then a member of Congress would get up and introduce that petition, and it would be a visual demonstration of the strength of public opinion that supported an issue. And clearly it was an attempt to lobby, to show how much support there was for a position or an issue, and to try to push Congress to legislate. We made a lesson about women's petitions because teachers asked us for resources for teaching about the history of American women. And so this is one of the best ways to get at it through the records of Congress. We went to the petitions that captured their opinions over time. And so in this lesson, the students are going to analyze petitions from 5 different eras to identify how women petitioned, what they petitioned about, and place their petitions in the context of their time, and ultimately understand how women used the First Amendment right to petition to make their voices heard. And so the lesson is for grades 8 through 12, but you could, if you're selective, you can use parts of it with younger students. You would select individual petitions for them to study, and I think it would work just fine. The way that the lesson is oriented is it considers 5 different time periods in women's political history. And so each station where the students will work will be focused on the actions of women at one point in time. So it's like one generation of women. And so on the screen right now, you see women's petitions in the Jacksonian era, for example. And so what they do is the students go to a station and they'll have a graphic organizer that you see on the left of the screen. And then they will have an assortment of petitions, 3 of them, and descriptions of petitions. And they work together to identify what the petition was about, and then to read through the descriptive information and summarize the historical context of this petition, then identify what social change the petitioners were seeking, and then reflect. Kind of an open-ended question, to summarize at the end, how does each petition show women using political means to achieve a goal? So that's the basic idea. I'm not going to show you that for each of the stations, so this will be our sample station, but that gives you the sense of the process that the students would engage in this activity. What we'll do now is look at some of the content that they would study. And so in the Jacksonian era, the 3 big issues in that time period for that generation of women was that they organized and petitioned as women, that they petitioned Congress opposing slavery on religious grounds, and that they petitioned protesting the gag rule, which would be a limitation of their right to petition. And we'll talk about each of these 3 topics through an example. In 1829, Andrew Jackson, in his annual message to Congress, called for American Indian tribes to be moved out of the eastern half of the United States, to be pushed beyond the Mississippi. Ultimately, when this took place, we call it the Trail of Tears. But as soon as President Jackson made this announcement, women began to protest. And the petition you see on the screen now, although it's too small to read it, we'll look at it in a bigger form in just a moment, is a petition that was created by a group of women. Now, this is kind of significant because in the 1830s, there are 2 things going on. One is the grassroots politics development that's going to bring common people into politics. But the other is the emergence of the idea of separate spheres, the idea that women should confine themselves to domestic activity. They should be angels of the home and leave sordid, corrupt things like politics to their husbands or their brothers. So men should deal with corrupt activities like the public world of politics. Women should be angels of domesticity. So this petition is an attention getter because despite that cult or that cultural concept of separate spheres, here you have a group of women writing to Congress. This is from 1830. And it's characteristic of that Jacksonian era politics because, again, it's a mass movement of people pulling their ideas together and expressing their opinions. And if you look at the petition as an artifact, you can start seeing some interesting things. And so at the top of it, it's written to the Honorable Senate and House of Representatives of the United States. And it says it's the memorial, and memorial is a word for a petition, of the residents of the state of, and you see Pennsylvania is crossed out. and written in next to it is the Ohio town of Steubenville. And so, you can see that from this artifact, it's kind of an interesting historical source, because when people have altered a document, you have like layers of information, and that invites the students to think about choices that people made as they changed the document. So how do you think this petition came to be in the hands of Ohio women? It seems like it was printed for Pennsylvania, but it was carried across the border into the town of Steubenville, where these women signed it because they agreed with its sentiment. The belief, as you see at the beginning of it there, that the present crisis and the affairs of the nation calls on all who can feel for the woes of humanity to petition Congress. And so the women are characteristically Victorian, and this gets back to that separate spheres concept I was talking about a moment ago, because if you look at what they say about themselves, and I think this could cause you students some anguish in our times, but when injury and oppression threaten to crush a hapless people within our borders, we, the feeblest of the feeble, appeal with confidence to those who should be the representatives of national virtues, as they are the depositories of national powers, and implore them to rescue the weak and unfortunate. And so the women are describing themselves as the feeblest of the feeble, but they're using also a certain irony to say, okay, if you men are empowering yourselves over us, then you should use this power to rescue other weak and unfortunate people, and do so with respect to the Native Americans. And so the women are pushing beyond what was considered their proper domestic sphere when they do this. So you get this idea of a group of women who are boldly asserting their opinion that Congress should take action with respect to the Native American tribes. And there's a certain irony in their argument. They're saying to men, okay, if you think that, in a patriarchal culture, you have more authority, then you must use your authority responsibly. If you think that men, you protect the weak, well, the Native American tribes are weak politically. You need to use your authority to protect them. And we're going to see a similar appeal, but with a religious dimension in the next petition. Now, we've talked about the cult of domesticity and grassroots politics. A third really important thing in this first half of the 19th century was the growth of evangelical religion. It's referred to as the Second Great Awakening. And this petition, which is an anti-slavery petition, will be just steeped in the Second Great Awakening religious movement. And you see how it opens: as immortal souls created by God to know him and love him with all our hearts, and our neighbors as ourselves, we owe immediate obedience to his commands respecting the sinful system of slavery beneath which 2.5 million of our fellow mortal children of the same country are crushed, soul and body, in the extremity of degradation and agony. And then they say, as women, and here you get that idea that women petitioning as women, it's incumbent upon us instantly and always to labor to increase the knowledge and love of God, that such concentrated hatred of his character and laws may no longer be so entrenched in men's bosoms and business. And so they are making a strong case on moral and religious grounds, but they're also being political, because if you just go down a paragraph or so in their petition, here's another excerpt. Let us petition till even for our importunity we cannot be denied. To facilitate this, we annex a form of petition and entreat the aid of every woman whose hand reaches it to circulate it and transmit the signatures to 46 Washington Street, Boston. So what they're trying to do is to generate a big petition, lots of communities sending in separate sheets that will go to Boston, be joined together, and then a member from Massachusetts would introduce them in the House of Representatives. And so we have women working together for political ends. And, with each of these petitions that we've looked at thus far, you see that the past is a foreign country. We've got these different values, these different sensibilities, and getting the students to think about how big a role did religion play in the lives of these women? How big a role did the cult of domesticity play in the lives of the Steubenville women? These are things that take history from just being facts and really translate it into an investigation of people who made choices as they lived their lives. Here's a third petition. This one's going to be protesting the gag rule. And this is a rule adopted in 1836 by the US House of Representatives that said they would no longer receive anti-slavery petitions. And so you see the text of the rule down below, that any petitions that come in basically are going to be automatically tabled. Well, to the opponents of slavery, what this said is that we're taking away your First Amendment right to petition. And so when you make a rule like this, you think you're going to shut off the flow of petitions. Well, what they did is they triggered a bigger flood of petitions, because now they've got a flood of petitions protesting the rule. And this one is from that flood, and it is from Brookline, Massachusetts. And I think it's cool for a number of reasons. It's from the women of Brookline praying that the gag rule be rescinded. And I like it because you can see the fill in the blank quality of it. The undersigned women of Brookline in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have learned with astonishment and alarm that your honorable body did on the 21st of December last adopt a resolution in the words following. And so you can see that it was printed and circulated with the intent that people in different communities would fill in the blank and sign it. Now, I want to use the chat box and get you into the conversation. There are three things I've pointed out on this petition. And what I'd like you to think about with the chat box is, what can you make of these three things? I'll tell you what I'm pointing to and then invite you to comment. You'll notice that there's different colors on the paper. It seems that down below it's a lined paper, up above it's not. Then you see these red circles in between. There's an arrow and a number 2 pointing to a red circle. And then there are some signatures. And does anybody recognize this point 3, the 2 top signatures? So go ahead and please use the chat box and tell me what inference you can make based on the details that I've pointed out by the arrows. Thank you, Marika. The Grimke sisters, yes. Oh, Ed, I think you're onto something there. Was the document cut and pasted? We should discuss that. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and talk about those first 2 points, and then if more points come in, we can discuss them. But yeah, let's start with the cut and paste one. So, you know, one of the things with petitions, you think, well, this is the authentic voice of the American people because they took the time to write out a document and send it in. Well, is it less authentic if they cut and paste? If they found this in a magazine, filled in the blank with their location, and then pasted it to a sheet of paper? Does that make it less authentic? Or is that just a realistic convention that would allow them to participate in a larger movement? And so this one clearly was cut and pasted. They cut out the top part, and you can see the wax seals, which is number 2, kind of the 19th century version of Scotch tape, where they sealed the top part, which they cut out, to the bottom part, which is lined paper. And then the third thing that you can notice is the signatures of the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, were incredibly important women in this time period. They were the daughters of a South Carolina plantation owner, yet they rebelled and they went up north and became leading abolitionists. Angelina marries Dwight Theodore Weld, and he's a leading colleague of William Lloyd Garrison. And the sisters are really active in the abolitionist movement, but they're also among America's first feminists because they're going to be pushing for women's equality in the 1830s. And so they're way ahead of their time in that regard. So this petition has a lot going on in it. And I think it's a good teaching tool because all those different dimensions are interesting, but also there are ways to, the kids would read about that in a textbook or another kind of text, and then they can go back to this document and see the real thing. So again, they fill in the blank, and I like that with their cut and paste petition. And they're considering the gag rule as a violation of the Constitution and of the rights of their representatives to freedom of speech as members of Congress, because their freedom of speech is constrained if they can't introduce petitions from their constituents. So I think there's a lot you can teach with that. Now, in that first generation, then, what we saw was women acting together. We saw the emergence of cultural movements like the Second Great Awakening and the Separate Spheres Convention, but you also see women participating in regional petition drives to make their voices heard. We'll move now to the next generation of women. This is the Civil War era, and it's going to be a different set of issues, and they are going to engage in lobbying Congress for suffrage. And it's right after the Civil War. And so the petitions we have here will be about having the federal government expand its control over voting and civil rights. And so the three petitions in this part of the lesson are one from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony calling for universal suffrage. A second, 12 years later, calling for an amendment granting women the right to vote. And then our third petition, which we'll look at a little closer, is Amelia Bloomer and other women petitioning individually to have their political disabilities removed. So if we look at this time period, we see in 1865, as the Civil War is coming to a close and they're rethinking the issues of civil rights protection and voting rights, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others are leading a drive for universal suffrage. And they will petition Congress, and you see that they respectfully ask for an amendment of the Constitution to prohibit the several states from disenfranchising any of their citizens on the ground of sex. The federal government doesn't so much grant the right to vote as prevent the states from denying it in this formulation. And here's their petition, the top of it anyway. And you can see that they're making arguments that will talk about how many people they are and how they're treated. And I've got those on the next slide, but what I want to show you here before we go to that is the fact that this was pasted, as was that Brookline petition. You can see at the bottom where the paste has kind of eaten through the top. So you had a petition with a printed part and then signatures pasted on the bottom. So in the printed part, some of the arguments are, we represent 15 million people, which is half the nation. We're intelligent, native-born American citizens, and yet we stand outside the pale of political recognition. And here, I think it really gets to the foreign country of gender in the 19th century. We are governed without our consent, compelled to pay taxes, punished for violations of the law. And yet we cannot vote. And the signatures, you see some famous ones: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, Lucretia Mott. And what you notice about it is the first petitions we looked at were local: Steubenville, Ohio, Brookline, Massachusetts. But look at this: women are organizing regionally across the Northeast, because we have New York, Rochester, Newark, Philadelphia, and Boston. And so you see that the lobbying group is spreading itself across the geographic region. And so you see a much higher level of organization and communication than in earlier political movements. However, it's unsuccessful. And so rather than quit, 12 years later, the same individuals will lead a movement, and they're going to take a different strategy. This time, they're going to say, okay, let's make a mammoth petition. Let's make a petition so big that nobody can ignore it. And so this is their 1877 appeal for a 16th Amendment. So by this time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment have been passed, but women still don't have the right to vote. And they want protection of the rights of women citizens of the United States. And that, of course, is an allusion to the 14th Amendment, that they're citizens. And the strategy you see down here in the bottom bullet, they want to roll up mammoth petitions to the new Congress so that they can no longer be neglected or forgotten. And here's the whole petition. Its print is kind of small to show in a PowerPoint, but I took some snippets of it. You saw the top snippet there. And then at the bottom, you can see that it's signed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton as president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So they want to get 10,000 petitioners to appeal for a 16th Amendment. And it begs the question of how much public support do you need for Congress to act? And in addition to that number question is, how strong an argument do you need to impel Congress to act? And in this one, they're going to use the same argument they used 12 years earlier, but they're going to strengthen it a little bit. We urge the women of the United States who are taxed without representation, governed without their own consent, classed with lunatics, paupers, and criminals and idiots before the law, denied the custody of their own children and their own persons, to work now for their own enfranchisement with the same energy, devotion, and enthusiasm which they have hitherto devoted to thankless toil in their homes and in the great fields of reform. Doesn't work. So the next movement that women will do in that Reconstruction era is individual women will petition Congress to have their disabilities removed. And we'll take just a quick look at one of these as a representative sample. It's from Amelia Bloomer, and she describes herself as a citizen of the United States and a resident of Council Bluffs, County of Potawatomi, State of Iowa. Now notice what she says. She's the owner of real and personal property amounting to several $1,000s on which she is taxed without representation. And she hereby respectfully petitions your honorable body for relief from this burden of taxation, or for the removal of her political disabilities, that she may be declared invested with full power to exercise her right of self-government at the ballot box. Okay, it's 1877 when this petition comes in. In the chat box, tell me, how strong is her argument? Do you think it's a convincing argument? Is she justified in asking Congress to give her the vote? Yeah, no taxation without representation. Hey, if that argument was so valid for 1776, why not 1876? And if that argument was so valid for men, why not for women? And so you get that. Now, we had a question up above about Lucy Stone. I don't off the top of my head know the answer to that question. However, I would invite Martha to email me on that topic, and I will ask an archivist and get you some documents on that. I know we have them. I don't know right off the top of my head which ones, but I would be happy to send you some links to things in our catalog. Here's Amelia Bloomer's letter. I think that it's good because it's handwritten and it's clear, and it begs the question of how much cursive can you students deal with? This might be an example of one where you can actually have them deal with the 19th century artifact, because although it's cursive, it seems clearly written. Many students could probably decode it, and it makes it more like real history if they're working with the actual document. But anyway, I just thought I'd show you that. But we need to move on because our time is so limited. We want to talk about the progressive era. Now here's the third generation of women we're discussing, and you'll notice that in the progressive era, the arguments are going to be different. What they argue about is going to be different. It won't be suffrage now in these petitions. It's going to be about the social conditions that emerge in the explosion of industry that happens, after the Civil War. And they're not going to make religious arguments like the Boston Anti-Slavery Society. They're going to use statistics, and we're getting into the age of science. And so look how they use numbers and how they talk about social conditions in a way that hasn't been done previously. So, just to give you a summation of the three big issues, one is about having lynching declared a federal crime. Second is a movement to ban child labor. And the third is participation in America's first big environmental debate, and which was a debate over a proposed dam that was to be built in Yosemite National Park. So here's, I think, the most powerful document in the whole National Archives. And this one is actually from 1922, and it's from the Colored Women's Club of Michigan. And it's African-American women creating a statistical study of the number of lynchings that took place in America from 1889 to 1920. And so you have a 30-year period. And what you can do is you can see where the lynchings took place and with what frequency. So just to call your attention to a couple of things quickly, notice like in Texas, in red, you can see there were 354 lynchings in 30 years. So, you know, you can see that you could do a math problem with how many lynchings per year is that. If you look in Louisiana, 326 in that 30-year period, but those are not the highest states. Mississippi has even more, and Georgia has the most. And so when you look in there, you could calculate the number of months, and you could say on average how many individuals were murdered in this way per month. And over here to the right of the map, you see a little finger, and under it says these 10 states, and you see the border around them. These 16 states, excuse me, furnished 88% of the lynchings from 1889 to 1921, and 81% of the votes against the dire anti-lynching bill. So an anti-lynching bill basically would make lynching a federal crime. The problem was that local people would form a lynch mob and they would kill a person, but then they would go before a local jury and the local jury would find them not guilty. So the idea that you have African-American women in Michigan who might have migrated there from the South, who have a club, and in their club, they're pushing for protection against lynching, perhaps shows that they are seeking to protect relatives and friends back home. We're going to talk about this map tomorrow as we talk about the Jim Crow era and how it gives us evidence of America in the Jim Crow era. But for today, we're just going to leave it with the notion of it's a powerful document that shows in the progressive era how women used statistics to make powerful arguments. And so our next document is going to look at the child labor issue. And I think it's equally powerful, but notice how different it is. It won't use numbers. It's going to argue in a different way. This is from a woman named Suzanne Heber. And she is interesting because she's an independent woman of the early 20th century. You see her job. She's a public stenographer and certified shorthand reporter. And you see her office is down near the courthouse in Manhattan, 53 Chambers Street. And you see her letter over there to the right. And so, you know, imagine you're in an archive and you open a box and you find this letter and you think, oh, this looks kind of cool. Let's take a closer look. So we do that. And what we find is that she's writing about a piece of legislation, the Keating-Owen bill. And that would ban the interstate commerce in items made by children or child labor. And so she writes, if you're one of those who are supporting the Keating-Owen bill to protect children who work, I apologize for writing to you on the subject. Then she says, for I cannot seem to believe that any men want to see the lives ground out of mere babies by hard labor. I was haunted for days by the horror of it when I first saw some of these children who work in the cotton mills trying to play after hours. I say trying to play because they seemed hardly to have the strength to play. And people said, oh, they're not so bad. You ought to see some of the others. As these little ones look to me like corpses, I'm glad to say I never saw the others. And so she's writing about the issue of child labor. And as you are teachers in New England, as you know, a good measure of that child labor happened in your states in textile factories. And here's some Lewis Hine photos of children at work in New England textile factories. They could equally have been in North Carolina or other states, but here you see the dangers that they faced. You know, children routinely, 10 years old, were sent to work in factories with very dangerous conditions. You see that girl's dress just waiting to be snagged in that equipment. This boy with those unguarded gears there, it's just horrible to think about the kind of accidents that that could happen to inattentive children in such a setting. And the third picture you see up top is a very depressing picture of a child standing near some spinning machines. And, you know, you just imagine how loud it is. You see all the cotton lint on the ground. And that's what their childhood looked like. And Susan Heber is saying, you know, after 12 hours of work in those conditions, they're more like corpses than children. And then next to her name in the postscript, she makes a strong point. She describes herself as one woman who wants the ballot for the purpose of helping these helpless little ones. So the challenge is, can you identify the 3 historical issues that are embedded in the quote that's on the screen right now? And go ahead and use the chat box and tell me if you notice what historical issues you see coming out of her postscript to her letter there. Yeah, child labor is certainly one of them. And women's suffrage is a second. And so, you know, you see how child labor, women's suffrage, and poverty all put together. And, you know, the third, if you looked at the whole document, is her name, of course, the fact that she's an independent woman writing separately to Congress. She's really working with a degree of autonomy that women of prior generations didn't always exercise, and she's writing to them on a political issue. And so what you have in this document is really like the invention of childhood, the idea that childhood should be a protected space. And we have petitions on both sides of that issue. And we have one of our lessons is about, it's called Kids at Work, and it's about child labor. And it has petitions from parents who want their kids working in the factories. And then we have other letters from people who want to ban child labor. And so anyway, you might be interested in taking a look at that. And of course, the third issue is building the dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And the document that gets at this makes the argument that the valley belongs to all the people and is used and enjoyed by the East as well as the West. And that gets at the notion of environment as a value in itself, that nature isn't just valuable because of what you can use it to do, but preserving it and not using it is a value. Now, with the Susan Heber letter and this environmental letter, you have the opportunity to use early 20th century progressive era documents to talk about issues that still exist, debates that are still ongoing, and for kids to see how the past is related to the present. You know, there are still arguments just like the Hetch Hetchy Valley debate. There are still instances of child labor in the world. And so you can use history to get kids to think about current issues as well. Now, the fourth part of this lesson is about petitions related to suffrage itself from the 1900 to 1920 time period. And if you look at them, and we're just going to look at them very quickly, you'll see 3 issues. One is that women's suffrage was won on the state level in several states, mostly in the West, before the 19th Amendment was ratified, about, in fact, a generation before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Secondly, that the women's suffrage movement in Southern states will reflect the racial discrimination of the Jim Crow era. And third, there was a strong, well-funded, skillfully led movement of women who were opposed to women's suffrage. And that's kind of an explosive one, and we have an explosive document on that. But this notion of state versus federal with respect to voting is because in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, it says that each state shall decide who will vote in elections that happen in that state. And so, you know, in some Western states that are thinly populated, women will get the right to vote quite early. So you see in the 1800s, you had Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho grant women the right to vote. Then in the 1900s, again, more Western states, Washington, California, Arizona. But the first Eastern state, New York, will grant women the right to vote only in 1917, the middle of World War I, and Michigan in 1918. So it's a kind of west to east movement. And I mentioned that because the first document that's in this part of the lesson has a cool map, and it is from Nevada and Nevada's Women Civic League. And we'll just look at their language for a moment. But before we do that, let's look at their map. So I would recommend you go in and cut and paste this map and isolate it and have the kids look at this map, because it's a great visual primary source. And it introduces the idea of, how suffrage was granted on the state level before the federal level in a kind of cool way, because you see the white states on this map are where women have full suffrage when the document was created in 1916. Then the diagonally shaded states are those where women had partial suffrage. And then the states that are in black ink are states where women could not vote. And so getting kids to think with a map and think through a visual primary source is kind of a cool thing. So, much though I like this document, I like the map even better. So I would personally suggest one of the things you could do was cut and paste that map. And if you use a high res version of this from the catalog, you can really get a really visual and clear map. So, you can see that the kids can make inferences. And because of time, we're not going to really dwell on it, although I would have liked to have. But I want to point out that from the text of that same document, what they point out is that Congress is not always the answer, that Congress can be the problem. Because in the second paragraph of their petition, they say, whereas the women of the country have been unfairly dealt with by the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives in the treatment accorded the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So women would petition Congress. Members of Congress in the 19th century would introduce legislation for women to get the vote, and none of it would ever leave the House Judiciary Committee. And so a few conservative individuals in the Congress could act as a dam, blocking the flow of history. And this was the case with the suffrage movement. And they put the finger on the Judiciary Committee of the House. And so part of the struggle is to change public attitudes about suffrage, but a bigger part of the struggle is to change attitudes within Congress itself. And so again, a historic issue that has relevance to today when we talk about legislation and where does it bog down and why does it bog down. The Jim Crow era, you can see reflected in this Texas document, the Texas Woman Suffrage Association. And I'm going to take you right to a passage in it, because they're saying in the petition, the same argument we've heard before, that taxation without representation is tyranny. Okay, but there's more, because here in the next paragraph where I have it underlined in red, look what they say. We're merely asking for the removal of a sex discrimination and not for any radical revision of the voting qualifications in any state. So we want women to vote, but all those measures that you have to keep African Americans from voting? Well, we don't want you to get rid of those. So essentially what they're saying in the southern states is, we want white women to vote. We don't want black women to vote. And so that's, again, a document from the eve of the 19th Amendment, but it gives you a sense of Jim Crow America and what this social movement was like. Now I'm going to ask you to talk about a document, and this document is from the genre of petitions that are opposed to women's suffrage, petitions written by women against giving women the right to vote. And it's the memorial of Alice Wadsworth of the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And she wrote it in 1917. And it's a pretty powerful document. And you'll notice that she's part of a national lobbying organization, and that if you notice the names over on the left-hand side, you'll notice that it's women who are part of this group with her, and they will sign themselves with their husbands' names. Mrs. Lewis Frossingham, Mrs. John B. Herron, and Mrs. Henry Thompson. Now, there are exceptions to that pattern, but not many. And so if you blow this up, if you get a high-res version of this, you can see what they stand for is manpower and against women having the right to vote. And yet you'll find that the letter is very clearly argued. It's not a rant. It's a real attempt to convince. It's very skillfully written. And it becomes a little ranting on the second page. And I think that it's kind of kid friendly because it is kind of outrageous. And so if you have the students look at this, you might direct them to look at this passage here. And, you know, if you look at that, I'm going to ask you in the chat box, do you think this could be a teachable document when you read the language that's on the screen there? You think this would engage a kid's attention? Nagging, pestering, socialist. Yeah, the people who petition for the suffrage are nagging socialists. The people who are against it, they're responsible. And so you have this us versus them thing. And it also goes against the flow of history, you know? And what is she talking about, that whole socialism thing? You know, she argues that it would give every radical woman the right to believe she could get any law she wanted by pestering her city council. And if feminism can be put through by pestering, so can pacifism, socialism, and other isms. So I thought you'd be interested to know what was happening when that letter was written. And so here's the newspaper from the day she wrote the letter. And you can see that the suffrage amendment is reported from committee in the House. So it's left the House Judiciary Committee and it's going to go out on the floor. But you can see in the Russian Civil War that the socialists are appealing to the people, that were after the November Revolution 1917. So now the socialists are in control in Russia, and that could happen here. So this is like the first seeds of the American Red Scare. So there's a lot going on in that letter. I do want to, though, wrap up with mentioning a couple of documents from the time period after the 19th Amendment, because you think, you know, when the amendment was passed, women got the vote, discussion closed. Not necessarily. And so what we find is that the 19th Amendment protected the right of white women to vote, but it didn't remove racial and ethnic barriers to voting. That immediately after the 19th Amendment, there was a movement to get an Equal Rights Amendment passed, starting in 1923. But it never would be pushed out of the House Judiciary Committee. It was always stifled there. And it took 49 years and a bold legislative maneuver, a discharge petition, to get the ERA out of committee. And throughout that time, leading advocates for women had to explain why an ERA was needed. And so the text of the 19th Amendment seems to say that no state can deny women the right to vote. But they did, as this pamphlet shows, because all the restrictions that were used to keep African Americans from voting, African American men from voting, were used to keep African American women from voting. And we have a document in the lesson that gets to that point. It's a document from a woman in Mississippi, and just a excerpt from it gives you a sense where she says, "I feel sure that I have given reasonable explanations to these sections of the Constitution of Mississippi. It's my sincere belief that because of race or color, I have not been allowed to register." And what that alludes to is the strategy of making rural, presumably illiterate voters read and explain very difficult texts as a precondition to voting, to keep Black people from voting. They didn't apply the same rules to white voters. And so she is complaining about that in a way that allows you to bring that issue into the classroom, that restrictive voting practice. I mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment. Here's the text of it from 1923 on the left of the screen. And it was introduced in every Congress. It's the topic that's been the subject of more constitutional amendments than any other topic. And here you have the discharge petition that Martha Griffiths introduced to make the Judiciary Committee give up that petition. But I want to take our last minute or so and look at this letter from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a giant of American history who sadly passed away recently. And she wrote this letter in 1971 in support of an Equal Rights Amendment. And she was like many leading women of her generation who had to explain over and over again why an ERA was necessary. And her letter is really short, and it's really gets to the point. But here's just a passage from the bottom of it. She's talking about legislation that was passed to create a Women's Equality Day in August of each year. But she says, although the Women's Equality Act of 1971 is a desirable supplement, it's not a substitute for the Statement of Basic Rights represented by the Equal Rights Amendment. And she says to a member of Congress, I very much hope that you will do all that you can to assure that in this nation, every person will be given equal opportunity to develop his or her individual talents. Application of this fundamental principle to women is long overdue. And she's kind of subtle, but what she's getting at is the difference between legislation and a constitutional amendment. Legislation's nice, but a constitutional amendment is a statement by the nation that says, as a fundamental characteristic of America, we believe in the equality of men and women. And that's what a constitutional amendment would do. And so she says, we don't just need legislation. We need to assert this fundamental principle. And so I don't know how you students would feel about that, whether an ERA is necessary or not, but you know, you have an opportunity to engage them in a conversation about it, because March 22nd, 2021 saw the introduction of the joint resolution you see on the screen here, which would remove the time constraint from the ratification of the ERA. As you know, it was passed by Congress and sent out to the states in 1972 with a 7-year time limit. The time limit expired before a sufficient number of states could ratify. But since then, the number has been reached. More than enough states have ratified it to make the ERA part of the Constitution. But you got to get rid of the time constraint to allow that to happen. So, you know, would your students support this resolution or not, is again a way to bring current affairs into the conversation. So I hope that these petitions and other documents that we've looked at have given you an idea of some resources that you can use to bring women's history into your classroom.